What really struck me about your question, trying to figure out how to articulate how accepting our feelings, ourselves, and self-love is an important core healing step, was really about just that of, well, how do you articulate it? So a search for the right words, a search for meaning in that way. I thought was quite compelling, and I thought, well, what better way to find the right words than to make a video and actually say it myself. So I thought I'd just take this opportunity to do exactly that, and I hope that you guys out there and you specifically appreciate the video. Now, I think it's really cool that you're trying to solve this problem, by finding the right words. Especially thinking about words as, say, tools. Tools that, when used well, or picking the right words, picking the right tool, actually opens up the world. I think it's a really cool modernist way of thinking, in the sense that our reason, our being of being able to connect with the world that we live in is just so potent that it has the capacity of speech is what enables us to connect with and contend with the world around us, to such a degree that it's almost like we're able to open up the facade of the world like it's a box, and just kind of, well, by speaking at it in the right way, that we can discover things that we didn't see before, that maybe they were there, but we didn't see before we were able to say it. And looking at it this way, there's a give and take, because with the power of speech, which reveals the world itself, the more refined we make our words, the more that we are able to pick the right, most appropriate tool, the more the world really does open up to us. I mean, this is our experience, that the more that we discuss things, the more that we work things, ideas, issues out with friends, the more master we have. I mean, this is the central technique of therapy, is speech. And when you do it, that give and take, it's kind of cool, because, the more that you do open up the world to yourself, the more you also find that the words that you were using to begin with, they got the world to open up, but then you also learn, well, wow, like, those were really quite inadequate. Like, they really did not hit the mark. Let's try to find a better way of putting this. It might be, just I guess as a side point before answering your question, it might be that you are answering this question to people. It might be that what you're doing is sufficient, and that it's because you've been, neck deep in these questions, and that the more you've articulated them, the more you've opened up for yourself. And so this might actually be something less, and I think this is great also, but it's not, it might be less of something having to do with your clinical work, and more you personally, which is, that's a good place to be, I suppose, like to really, push deeper. So to address this question, I think we'll have to operationalize all of these concepts, and man, they are thick. Well, what's acceptance? What are feelings? Self-love, and healing. These terms are definitely up for grabs. Quoting Hans Eisnick, I think that 90% of the solution to problems is really in how accurate we articulate the question. And so I thought, well, I could make a video about, me operationalizing all these terms, but I figured, it might be a better, shorter hand to just kind of give you maybe some of the books and thinkers that were most influential for me, that helped me feel like I was having a tighter grasp of these concepts. So as far as getting my fingers underneath feelings, I really got a lot out of the emotion theorists and the neuroscientists. People like Jack Panksepp, Jeffrey Gray. Their books are not easy. Those they'll probably take you a year to really get through both, to make them useful. But I really think it's well worth the effort, because they're coming from an evolutionary standpoint of looking at emotions as having a functional use. And for myself, looking at emotions as a sixth sense, really. I mean, just the same way that we see color and we hear sound, we also sense meaning. Well, that sensing meaning is coming from our ability to feel. That's what gives moral significant valence to our experiences. being able to develop a taste for that, an appreciation for that is incredibly powerful. I found that the more I was able to understand their works, it was almost it was a certain, clinical judo move almost of using the energy and the force within the emotions of my clients and, redirecting that energy towards functional meaning, and then going from there and refining, okay, well, maybe it is legitimate you're angry, and maybe it is legitimate that you're upset. There's wisdom there, there's meaning there to actually unpack. So let's do that, but we can use this theory of emotions as a guide to do that. But that was just incredibly powerful in my work. As far as acceptance goes, I thought that the most mature, that's a good word, the most mature way of the most mature development, the most mature treatment of acceptance was really with the ACT folks, and really RFT more specifically. Because the way they kind of put it is acceptance is, it's not just a behavior, but it is. It's a behavior that you build, but more so, they made the dangerous aspects of acceptance more accessible. And I think it's those dangerous aspects of acceptance that a lot of clinicians avoid. One of the things that I thought was most interesting with ACT practitioners specifically, within the hexaflex, diagram there, present moment interventions. Well, that's one side of the hexaflex, but most clinicians steered away of those, steered clear from those. They make you uncomfortable. Because there's a dark side to acceptance, because there is, pain that we have to contend with, and self-hate we have to contend with, and those things might not necessarily go away, yet being able to accept those is not the way out of them, but it's a way to get through life with them. And it's hard to do. And I would recommend, taking a look at the clinical manuals of ACT, but then double back and hit hard the RFT stuff, because what I found was, when I was definitely blown away with Stephen Hayes's stuff, but then when I went back and I looked at his book, like Rule Governed Behavior, it was like that really liberated, it really freed my ability to not just access the techniques of ACT, but to actually, to really have a stance in them and to use them in a more flexible way. So I definitely suggest check that book out. But again, that is reading that book will put hair on your chest. Those behaviorists, they really hit it. But it's worth reading. It's worth reading through, and to get, again, getting those questions, getting those ideas accurately defined is really powerful. And this is something that I think is a broader topic, is I don't think that any one therapeutic tradition has the answer to these things. But again, getting that articulation, and I found that behaviorists did a better job of definition, makes it more accessible, especially because they're trying to develop technologies to use in therapy as opposed to more abstract psychological concepts. Again, nothing to take away from other therapeutic traditions, but that was my experience. So what is self and what's self-love? I think those are a lot more tricky to tackle. And I'm going to, despite that, I'm going to try and answer your question through these two concepts. Hitting self first, trying to figure that one out. I think it's a good question to kind of ask, well, what's the self you're loving here? I think that's a good place to start in articulating a definition of self. Because I think, functionally, well, what's self? Self's a map. I think it's really as simple as that. Our self is a map that we've developed, which helps us organize how and to what extent we observe the world around us. That's what, it's that map that gives us the ability to notice meaning. We have this problem, we literally can't see everything. We have these biological limits that we just can't get around. And it's not even just can't see everything. We don't. Most things we are unable to see. And so kind of looking at it that way, no pun intended, our basic axioms and our beliefs, what they are, well, they're really filtered out. We're kind of deciding, well, what's important, what's not important ahead of time. And with that under our belt, well, that's what we see the world as. So we already have this hierarchy of beliefs, this hierarchy of meaning that's, pre-constructed, and well, a lot, that's genetic, or the family, the place we live, there's a lot of components that go into that. But it's a map of belief nonetheless. And I think that's really that map is mostly a moral question. And I'm going to get to that idea a little bit later, I think, when I hit self-love. But, it's so cool. We actively, with this hierarchy of meaning, we actively ignore more than what we're able to see. It's not a, I think the point there is it's not a passive process. It's an active process of ignoring. And that's what makes life more manageable, reducing the complexity of life to something that we're able to engage in a meaningful way, is mostly through ignoring. And I think that kind of jumping off that idea, the behaviorists gave, I think, more of a concrete voice to what the existentialists were trying to deal with, was that the self in every person is quite a bit different because we organize our ignoring in different ways. And taking that one step further, what the behavioralists put forward is, well, wait a second. If that's the case, if really this map of meaning is predicated on the behavior of ignoring and then, directed attention, that's the other side of it. I'm not saying we're always ignoring, but well, then isn't self a behavior? Aren't we then really just walking around selfing all the time? And this really comes out in ACT, is that, they take that one seriously, is that self is not necessarily looked at as a static thing, but is something that you can flexibly choose to adopt or ignore. You really see this come out in the creative helplessness interventions in ACT, and also, the question, well, in DBT and ACT also, how's that working out for you? Trying to get rooted in, well, how you're behaving. Is that working out for you? This is your map of meaning. This is how you've sized up your axioms. And listen, okay, fair enough. You're paying attention to certain things and ignoring others. But, is that getting you through? Well, that's kind of sneaking in to go to this next level of, okay, well, if it's not working out for you, well, maybe you can act differently. We can do something different. Maybe you can be somebody different. And you see this also in a lot of CBT interventions too. From a cognitive perspective, this is not solely the purview of the third waivers, but I think that's a better way of looking at self as less static and more as a behavior. Pushing this one even further, that we're able to choose different acts of selfing, I think lines up pretty nicely with the cognitive psychologists and how they're conceptualizing, parts of selves, this sort of modular view of the mind that I think, we can credit Freud as initially discovering, but the Jungians really developed, that it's less like from a cognitive model that we have a bunch of programs in our brain, but that there's actual real living beings within inside of us. And they are different, that they have their own thoughts and they have their own feelings, they have their own philosophies. And, when you're in that one particular state, it really is harder to access another one. You kind of play around with this in marriage therapy. Two people come in and man, they can't even think of one good reason why they married each other. Well, it's because they're in one particular type of self. The feelings of anger that they have for each other just reorganizes their biology in such a dramatic way that they literally can't access those memories of happiness. And they're there. That part of them is there too. But I guess, my point is, self is something too dynamic to define. It's more something that you're trying to observe the different types of selves that are there. And I think, IFS, is a great example of work being done trying to reduce the complexity, say, of the Jungian archetypes to something that's user-friendly, and they do exactly that. Now, in addressing self-love, I'm gonna present a radical idea. I think that self-love as a concept, as a treatment goal, as a treatment target, I think does more to hold people back than is actually useful in pushing people's lives forward. Because I think when it comes to self-love, that's what people are looking for. They're really trying to find a relief from the pain that they're having, and it's like, well, why can't I just stop hating myself? Where is this self-love? It almost becomes like a holy grail to discover, and and I'm not so sure that it's something that can be entirely adopted. And what I mean by that is, take Stephen Hayes and Carl Jung for that matter. In their idea of, that's one side of the story, self-love. That's only one part of who we are. And, Hayes even more so, makes a really good case that trying to follow or get self-love can actually become a rule governing behavior. It becomes a should. You ought to love yourself, and becomes just that much more ammunition for self-hate, for shame. And, even if it doesn't get that bad, you definitely have the different associations that just the mind automatically makes, that, as soon as you say black, you think white. As soon as you say up, you think down. As soon as you say self-love, you think self-hate. It might be something you can never escape. And so trying to achieve that, if you're only trying to achieve that, I think it's a lost cause. I think it's an absolute lost cause, and runs the risk of developing only half people. This idea reminds me of a debate that Carl Rogers and Martin Buber had. It was really interesting. You can get a hold of the transcripts. It's really interesting to go through. But they put on this public debate, and there's a lot of common ground they had. They mostly agreed that disagreed. But the dramatic moment in their debate, in their public discussion, was when Martin Buber hit hard against Roger and said, listen, like your idea of unconditional self-regard, there's a lot to say that's good about it, but your theory does not address the phenomenon of evil. It just doesn't. You have to also contend with that. Now, and I realize that that's a more existential question, so you existential therapists, by all means. So I wouldn't necessarily be thinking, be suggesting, go ahead and run with that when clients come in your door. Where can we open up, personal evil here? Number one, I think that's too moralistic for most clients to explicitly jump into immediately. But, secondarily, people are walking in wrecked, and bringing in that sort of catastrophe of life, that's too much. That's too much. You might have to build people up more. But what I would say is, as the clinician, man, that's worthwhile having in the back of your mind. Because again, ultimately, getting back to the definition of self is a map of hierarchies of meaning. That is the beginning of moral action. And, now listen, treatment-wise, I'm much more of a utilitarian, and I think that before even approaching the question of self-love, it's worth checking out a person's environment first. Because, and this kind of gets into your question of, healing and what is healing. I think that the vast majority of problems people are walking in with, it might not be the stated problem that they have, but I think most of them are really rooted in their environment. People come in, the first questions I'm asking is, okay, well, how's work going? You're bringing in the money. Are you able to tackle your bills? Is that sorted out? How's sleep going? Does your wife have the washing machine? How are you going to be able to get that? Is that doable? How are your kids doing? Are they getting the tutoring that they need? Trying to deal with the problems they're having in school. These are normal life problems. These aren't necessarily what we would call, mental illnesses. But, if you have a mental illness, these are just going to hike those up like you wouldn't believe. And 9 times out of 10, it's just being able to figure out these more environmental issues that really is the fundamental problem that people are having in life. I mean, here, put it this way. You kind of getting back to the neuroscientists. I mean, like, look at the nervous system. I mean, that sucker basically is mapping onto the environment with an unbelievable amount of accuracy. I mean, before we're able to actually observe the world that we're filtering, our nervous system is already at play analyzing, assessing the world we live in. In many ways we're outsourcing psychologically our psyche into the world around us. So, I mean, it stands to reason, well, if that's the case, you might as well try and address those first, and they're a lot easier to address. I mean, you take, people say with personality disorders, I challenge you, you ask every single one, how's your sleep? They're getting 2-3 hours of sleep at best. And if you're able to see improvement on that, I mean, if you get somebody who's coming in with, an SCL 90, they're scoring clinical levels and everything, take 10 weeks to focus on developing a healthy, consistent sleep habit. Those scores are halved. So, before maybe even talking about, self-love as a core element of healing, I think addressing practical living might be easy. I don't know if it's more important in the sense of like a meaning sense of the word, but I think from a practical sense, they're more important and they're easier to sort out. And and in line with this way of thinking about healing as kind of like domains of healing, like a hierarchy of healing, that being the first place to focus. Well, then next up is going to be, focusing on relationships, and then focusing on the individual last, vis-a-vis himself. And kind of getting back to the question of morality that I mentioned earlier. When you have like a dominance treatment designed this way of, how's the environment, how's your relationship, how is yourself, what you're really asking is, how ought I respond to my environment? How ought I respond to others? How ought I respond to myself? Well, that's moral questions. Carl Jung said that, that moral development is a substitute for psychology. I think that's 100% true. Because when people are coming in, they're asking, how do I solve my problems? Great, how do you solve your problems? Okay, we have to organize that. You have to make moral decisions on what is a problem and what would be the right way of solving that problem. I mean, that is the heart of moral questioning, moral living. And taking that one drop farther, as a therapist, if what you're really doing is trying to guide a client to better moral living, well, what are you doing? What's your role as a therapist? And I think there again, Jung hit it on the head, is that the therapeutic act is an act of love. It's based on love. And then for yourself as a therapist, well, then it becomes for yourself a moral question, is how ought I respond to this person who I love? Who I'm trying to, again, like, love as a moral responsibility. That's a fair question to tackle. I wonder how, I don't know, I'm curious, how many therapists would really buy into that way of thinking about the work that they do as being demonstrating love in a moral way, pushing people's lives forward through that mechanism. I'm curious, So kind of tying all these different ideas I'm shooting out to maybe make more sense of it here, cutting through the jungle. Yes, there needs to be self-love. That it definitely has to be a focus in treatment. Because it's a relationship with yourself. Fundamentally, you have to be able to relate to yourself just like you're relating to the environment and just like you're relating to other people. But I think you can't lose sight of that dark side. That has to be contended with. Using more IFS language, that's kind of more the idea of unblending the protectors, bringing them out, inviting them to express themselves as well. And also you say, the Jungian analysts and the existentialists also, I think, took that idea farther in the sense of making a push. We can't avoid, we can't ignore our dark side. You know, they are really there. They are beings that are, you know, whether we like it or not. And that a part of self-love is maybe it's more developing a deep respect for the parts of ourselves that we don't, or the parts of ourselves that we're afraid of. And here also I think is in the spirit of ACT, in the sense of not holding on to any type of identity too rigidly. You know, if I have to be a self-lover, you know, that also can be limiting and deny a person a certain amount of flexibility they need to, you know, again, using ACT terminology, you know, to, you know, lacking the flexibility here to be effective in one's environment. So kind of riffing off that idea of developing respect, self-respect, you know, I wonder, you know, also this idea of, you know, Jung as Jung's idea of therapy being a love process, a moral love process. You know, I wonder if love itself, the love that a person can feel for oneself, you know, is that an outcome of real honesty? You know, maybe that's the power of honesty that speech produces, of, again, trying to, you know, bringing in this idea of trying to articulate truth. Well, maybe honesty does exactly that, in the sense of the more that we are engaging ourselves, the more we are engaging the world, the more we're trying to crystallize and articulate our thoughts, you know, if that's what ultimately does produce love in any context for ourselves and other people and the world around us. So I think summing up this long-winded response here, I guess I am pushing back on the idea that self-love is a core of healing, and I don't think it is. I don't think it's the core at all. I think it's a part of it, but you know, it might be more useful, say, to, you know, if you look at all the different therapeutic traditions, you know, and ask, well, what's the common denominator of treatment for each one? You know, I think it's courage. I think it's developing courage to face the things that we don't want to face. You know, whether with the psychodynamic folks, it's facing and integrating your shadow, or trying to be more aware of transferences, or, you know, from a behavioral standpoint, exposure therapy itself, of physically going to things that cause you fear, or from a CBT tradition, you know, schema challenging experiments. Or, you know, third wave, you know, ACT and DBT. I mean, those are emotion exposure therapies fundamentally at the end of the day. You know, but all those different traditions, they're really shooting for the same thing, that the core of healing is developing oneself courageously, acting courageously, learning how to do that. And then sometimes that does mean developing self-love. But I think it also means developing a healthy awareness and, again, a self-respect for every part of our being, no matter how much we wish it wasn't there. I hope that was helpful, useful in the work that you're doing.